Oh well. Okay. Sorry for that. That didn't work out. But welcome to book club. Today we're doing Hume and his famous book Inquiry for Human Understanding. And this book is like all about the types of knowledge we can have and then how we should think about the knowledge that we have. I went over sections 1 to 4 last time, but since there weren't like one person showed up, and the recording was terrible on the live stream, I'm just gonna kind of breeze over the introductory stuff once again, so we're all on the same page, and then talk a little bit about what happens in sections 5, 6, and 7. So essentially, Hume at the very, very beginning, he sets off making this distinction. And he makes this distinction between two types of moral philosophies, or two types of philosophies that there are. One of them is what he calls the philosophy of action. So when you ask, the closest thing I can like analogize this to is when you ask someone, what is philosophy? What's the purpose of philosophy? And they answer something along the lines of, it's to live a good life, it's to change your behaviors, it's to change the way you act. This is closer to this philosophy of action. It's a very like poetic, almost beautiful type of philosophy. It sounds really nice to the ears. It's very agreeable for the majority of people. It's not anything that's difficult to grasp. It's like just the popular type of philosophy. Literature might get really close to this. So he says we have this type of philosophy. We have the philosophy of action, and then we have another type of philosophy, the philosophy of theory. And this is more of like an armchair type of philosophy. The philosophy that, you can just do while you're thinking in your head sitting in a corner. And it concerns itself almost entirely with mental attitudes, um, with things that don't very clearly influence behavior or don't really clearly influence the way we act in day to day life. In this type of philosophy, the goal is to be extremely systematic, extremely precise. Almost like how in mathematics, right? The concepts are very abstract, but the math itself is incredibly precise. There's no approximations, no almost this or almost that. It's very you know, methodical and systematic. And he thinks that this is the type of philosophy that we should try and engage in when we're trying to understand truths about the world, not necessarily that philosophy that's very flowery, that has us writing in these nice long poems that sound very, very nice to the ear. So it's this philosophy of theory that we're going to try and investigate or try and use as a tool to understand the more fundamental truths. And, what fundamental truths are we trying to get at? He's trying to get at the fundamental truths of the human mind. And he draws this analogy here between an anatomist and like a painter, right? So a painter, his goal is to draw something appealing to the human eye, make something that's beautiful that when we look at it, the colors pop and the shapes look certain ways and the shadows align and all that type of stuff. The anatomist, on the other hand, he's also concerned about the human eye, but only insofar as its basic biological components. He just kind of really cares about, how thick is the lens, how far can it stretch, what colors can the iris be, how much can a pupil dilate. And, some might think this is a bit of like a grotesque thing if you're just looking at an eyeball and not looking at it for it, or not trying to study it in terms of its beauty and its capacities, more so just in its flat out facts and terms and like bruteness. And so he thinks that this philosophy of theory person is closer to an anatomist studying the eyeball from a very scientific and nitty gritty sense. And then the philosopher of action, or the philosophy of action, is one more concerned with beauty and painting and that type of stuff. The mere philosopher. His whole project then in this book is to, in this treatise, is to understand the fundamental laws, basically, that govern the mind. So in the same way that someone like Newton was able to figure out the fundamental truths of physics and of the universe, how celestial bodies moved and related to each other, Hume here, he wants to understand how what our mental geography looks like, how the will interacts with imaginations and passions and thoughts and all this type of stuff, but from a very, very fundamental and non-flowery way. He doesn't want to just say like, the virtues drive us to act in this way, or our passions lead us to these beliefs. He wants to be a little more systematic, a little more slow about, a little bit more methodical about how we understand this type of stuff. And so what he asks us to do is to kind of look back at the example that we had of astronomers and their understandings of the planets. So before Newton came along, some people like Galileo, they kind of had these understandings that, maybe they're rotating around each other, the bodies are kind of moving, there's some sort of relationship between them. Once they got rid of the, what is it, the heliocentric model, where they thought that the idea where the Earth was the center of the solar system, they had like these basic understandings, but no precise, exact fundamental laws until Newton came along and said, oh no, inverse square law, or this is the gravitational constant. Nothing very strict or rigid. And so he wants to be basically the Newton of the mind and understand the mind in a very precise way, without making any assumptions, without making any jumps. And so he kind of says there in page 7, it's still better if by reasoning in this easy manner, I can undermine the foundations of an abstruse philosophy. An abstruse philosophy being this philosophy of action that seems always to have served only as a shelter to superstition and a cover to absurdity and error. So he's almost like, he's pointing the finger a little bit at these philosophers of action and saying that the people who are writing these very nice stories and like coming up with these very fancy theories, they're not understanding the mind in terms of its fundamental nature, more so trying to argue for the sake of arguing, or argue for the sake of having people accept their superstitions and that type of stuff. Assumptions, basically. He doesn't like that stuff. And so he starts to talk about in section 2 what an idea is. Where do ideas come from? You have ideas of tons of different things. There's almost an infinite amount of ideas you can have. You can think of like a horse with the head of a man, or the head of a horse with the body of a man, and just like combine them and make them think of like infinite amount of random things. And he makes a distinction though between the type of things we can think of. So one of them he calls impressions. This is the type of stuff that we receive and understand through our senses, essentially. So like when I look at this trail mix, it's a very, very lively thing that I see with my eye, and the rods are, firing in certain ways to send this blue image to my visual cortex. It's like a very real sensory experience, a lively thing. And the other types of thoughts or ideas we can have are what he calls ideas, I guess. And these are very, very, well, not very faint things, but fainter perceptions that we need to like look inwards towards. So like if I wasn't looking at this bag of trail mix, I can still imagine it. I can like hold it in my mind. I can kind of like think up of it, but it's not as lively or as vivid as if I were to look at it with my own eyeballs in this instant. There's two different things there that we can hold in our minds. These types of ideas, and then these types of vivid impressions. And so, when we have these thoughts, these less vivid things, it seems like our mind is unbounded. Like we have an infinite amount of things that we can possibly think of, right? So you can think about, hypothetical situations, you can think about the future, the past, you can think about becoming the president, or of flying, or of speaking 20 languages. Even if those things seem very, very unlikely, we can still think about them. The funny thing about thoughts is that it's impossible to have a thought about an absolute contradiction. And what an absolute contradiction is something that we cannot think of. An example of an absolute contradiction is like, if I asked you right now, try and think of a round square. It's like, go, think of a round square. you can't really. That's a contradiction. A square can't be round by definition. So it's these types of things that are beyond thoughts. We can't think of those types of things. We cannot think of things that contain in them absolute contradictions. But we can think of very, very unlikely things, like me being the president, or of me flying, or speaking 20 languages. There's no contradictions. There are no contradictions going on there. But then he goes to say in section 3, I believe, or in section 2, maybe 3, he uses the example of a golden mountain. He's like, okay, well, we can have a lot of ideas, right? We can have a lot of thoughts, but they have some limitations. Well, one, they can't be contradictions, but they still can be things that don't really exist. And he uses the example of a golden mountain to kind of illustrate this idea. He says, well, obviously there's no such thing as a mountain made of pure gold. But what's happening there, the reason we're able to imagine this golden mountain is because we're able to combine, transpose, enlarge, or shrink different things we've already seen in the world. So at one point or another, you've probably seen the color yellow, or a picture of a gold bar, and you've probably also seen like a mountain, or a hill at least, or pictures of mountains, pictures of hills, and all we do is like we're slapping those two things that we've experienced together, and now we have a thought. And so long as there's no contradiction in those two things, we can hold that thought in our minds. If you try to do that with a circle and a square, or a round square, then all of a sudden there's a contradiction, we can't imagine it, we can't really think of it. So his first argument along these lines, or just kind of going over these thoughts and ideas and impressions, is that all of our ideas end up being feebler perceptions, or basically just copies of impressions we've had at one point or another. Seeing this blue thing, that's an impression. Once I take it away and I ask you to think about it, have a thought about that, it's like weaker, it's fainter. He says that whenever we analyze complex or elevated ideas, we always find it composed of simple ideas. So a golden mountain, it's two simple things. Gold, mountain, put them together, golden mountain. Every simple idea in such combinations was copied from an earlier feeling or sensation, an impression. We could not have that idea of a golden mountain if we've never seen something similar to a mountain, or if we've never seen something similar to gold. So in that way, all the ideas we've had, or all the ideas we can have, all complex ideas, can be traced back to simpler ones, which are, in the end, just copies of these impressions. So even something like God, he kind of pokes at the religious people here. Something like God, really what it is, when people say they can imagine God or they can think of God, really they're just thinking of like maybe an authority figure, maybe like a teacher or a parent, or a boss, and then they're like expanding that idea as big as they can think of, and then now that's what they call God. So this is what he's saying is going on when we're having these ideas in our heads. We're just like mixing around stuff we've seen before. If a person lacks a sensory capacity, so imagine someone's blind, that person can never form those corresponding ideas. It's just another way of saying that if you're blind, you can never hold on to a proper idea of blue or of red. And that the same dependence of ideas on prior impressions hold for inner feelings and passions. Someone who's never fully loved cannot hold that thought of love, in the same way at least that someone who has fully loved can hold the thought of love. Therefore, the presence of an idea depends on prior experiences. So what we can hold in our mind depends on what we've experienced before. And so then there's like a colors objection that he addresses. So like imagine you have a bunch of shades of colors, like you're at Home Depot or something, and you see like from like light blue to dark blue. And then all of a sudden one of the shades is missing. Some people say, well, can't you just like fill in that shade with your imagination? If you know what very light blue is and very dark blue is, then you could probably just imagine what blue is. So maybe we don't actually need impressions from simple ideas. If if I knew about the number 1 and the number 2, then I can think of the number 1.5. So this is what some people will kind of say. No, we don't need these impressions to form ideas. And just like I kind of talked about in the couple slides ago, we can mix up this stuff in terms of their resemblance, in terms of their contiguity, or like how they might follow. So what would be an example of contiguity? It's like if I saw a small tree and then I saw a grown-up tree, I would be able to imagine a medium-sized tree because these things kind of grow continuously. And we can also think about things in terms of cause and effect, right? So if this caused that, then we can kind of imagine these events or hold these events in our minds. And now he talks about relations of ideas or demonstrative truths. So he thinks that we can reason, or humans always reason in two types of ways. One of these ways is in relating ideas. So you can do this simply by sitting in your chair and closing your eyes. When we're doing geometry or math or logic, when we're dividing numbers or adding them or anything like that, we are relating ideas and we're coming up with proofs, essentially. That 3 times 5 equals 15 is a proof you can come up with in your head. You don't need to see that out in the real world. You can just kind of think it up. Falsehood of that thing would imply a contradiction. And we can find those contradictions just by thinking alone. Like a round square. We cannot think of that. Therefore, it's a contradiction. Therefore, just by a priori thinking, we can kind of discard it. The other one, the more interesting one, the one that I guess Hume is famous for, is this matter-of-fact type of reasoning that most people engage in. And this is the type of reasoning that he really wants to like hone in on and poke some holes in. He says that empirical truths, things that we consider to be empirically the case, so like something like the sun will rise tomorrow, or fire is hot, or candy tastes good, this is all stuff that we've learned from past experience, but not established through demonstration. So they require a little bit something beyond just sitting in a chair, closing your eyes, and thinking about it. If you're sitting in a chair, closing your eyes, and just thinking, you can't come to the conclusion that the sun will always rise tomorrow. It needs to be something else. It needs to be other people saying that they've seen the sun rise every morning, or you seeing the sun rise every morning, and then from there you can reason this matter of fact that the sun will rise tomorrow or that fire is hot. So usually we gain our knowledge through this matter of fact reasoning. So we try and predict things happening in the future by appealing to cause and effect. So if, for example, we got a letter and it said from France and it was from our friend, we would reason that our friend is in France. Or if we hear a voice, then we reason, there must be a person who was causing that voice, who was causing that sound. But then he's encouraging us, okay, cool. This is how we commonly understand things. This is how we normally understand matters of fact, but let's get like a little bit skeptical and let's see why we actually think this way. And he says that no a priori discoveries of causal powers exist, really. You can't deduce. Imagine you have like two objects, that this hits this and then this moves. You can't say, Hume says, that this caused this to move. All you can say is that you saw this get close to this and then you saw this move over here. So he's saying that you can't see with your eyeball causation. You can just see movement of things. But something causing something else is almost like invisible. We can't just look at things happening in the world and then say, this thing is causing that thing, which is really, really unintuitive and really weird to wrap your head around. Because we always think about things in terms of event causing another event, or something causing something else. And so then he brings in this terminology of necessary connections, which we'll kind of get into in 2 seconds. And necessary connections is this tie, this link that effects and causes have to each other. So when this hits this, he says that there's this type of necessary connection that leads us to believe that this must move over here. And so what he says is that the effect is always distinct from its cause. These two things are separate, but we think about them as like tied together. as connected necessarily from them hitting each other. And imagining alternatives is easy and coherent. There's no reason, logically speaking, for me to do this and then this to move up. It might seem weird. We've never experienced before. We've never experienced that type of like motion before, where I hit this and then it moves down. But it's logically possible. We've just never seen it happen before. And so it's easy to think of these alternatives to causal outcomes, be a different case. So his reasoning is that we can't just infer past things to future occurrences. I cannot say that just because everything in the past 13 billion years has respected gravity, that it will respect it again. Each time I drop this mouse, I cannot be 100% certain it's going to drop. And that's basically what he's saying there. Deductive reasoning is something that lacks, or deductive reasoning is something that lacks this type of rational proof. Or maybe it's inductive reasoning. Sorry, that's a typo. Inductive reasoning. So saying that X will happen just because it happened in the past, that's not good enough. This is a psychological bias or a psychological effect happening. Just because it's always been the case that the sun rises every morning doesn't mean it must be the case that it will rise tomorrow, if we're being skeptical. And then this brings us to what was kind of in store for today. His exploration into skepticism. And so he says here that philosophy, he starts it off in saying that philosophy is something it can be very, very dangerous. He says that sometimes philosophy is taken to be this type of tool for finding the truth, to getting at truths. But other times people take philosophy to be something that's not as driven towards the truth as it ought to be. Or at least that sometimes things get in the way of it finding the truth. So he kind of pokes holes, or like he brings in philosophies like Stoicism or hedonism or virtue ethics, and says that their focus is in either learning how to live a good life or how to be a good person. Their focus might be in how to experience as much pleasure and as minimal amount of suffering, when really the focus of philosophy should be understanding things and figuring out the truth. Plain and simple. Whether we like the truth or not, the goal for philosophy should be finding the truth. And so it seems like sometimes we're getting mixed up with these pleasures of the mind and pleasures of the body when we're doing philosophy, and he doesn't like that. Not with skepticism, though. He holds skepticism at a higher level than all these other types of philosophies, because all skepticism cares about is figuring out the truth, and it's okay when it can't figure out that truth. And so he keeps on pushing this idea, and he says that, well, he gives a little thought experiment, basically, to prove that this cause and effect, this hitting this and then moving that way, is just a psychological phenomenon. It's a psychological bias we have. So it's I'm not sure if I totally understand this part of the text, but as I understand it, he's like, okay, imagine there's a little person who's very, very intelligent, and they pop into the world. They have zero experience, zero knowledge about how this universe works, like some sort of an alien or something. And this person, they see an event happen. This hits this and goes there. Now he reasons that this person that popped into the universe wouldn't be able to say that, this caused this. Because the only reason we usually say that this caused this is because in the past we've had experiences of this causing that. This causal thing is purely experience-based. We only have this bias because of experience. If it were the case that for all of history, whenever I hit something, it flies up, then that would be my psychological bias. And I would say that, cause and effect always works like this. And so he's saying that if a smart person were to pop into this universe and see how causation works, or see how things work, how events interact with each other, he wouldn't be able to draw causal information from it. Imagine this person again, and they experience a world where, for example, whenever you see this pops into existence, right? Or whenever, the example I had here is like whenever I pour water onto a dry towel, a wet towel pops up in its place. So this experience would still not give him any idea or knowledge about how one thing is causing the other. How are they just popping in and out of existence? How would we know that one thing is causing it? And it just isn't a random quantum fluctuation or something, I don't know. He thinks he's just trying to push this idea that cause and effect are purely psychological. And then he brings us to one of the last like terminology things that you'll probably need to care about in this book or in this treatise, and that's of custom and habit. So he's not saying that this tendency for us to see one thing cause another thing is bad. He just says that all of these inferences come from experience, so we're not going to call them reasoning. It's more appropriate to call them custom. It's very, very customary to see this, hit that, and then this move that way. And then say, this caused this. It's like habit. It's like we got into like a routine of seeing the way the world worked. And then, in doing so, we mistakenly called it reasoning when really it was just custom or habit. And then he asks a further question. He's like, okay, well, when we believe certain things, an aspect of the mind, is this a choice, or can we actively choose to believe certain things then? Or is it something that just happens to be the case necessarily? So he says that belief is perfectly natural, but not rational. So there's no reasoning going on, but it's perfectly natural for it to happen. It's not an epistemic certainty. It's just something we're kind of reflexively doing all the time. And it's reliable enough in practice when we're being pragmatic about the world. And that's how science is able to continue, right? Imagine if like each time you tried to conduct an experiment, you were like, wait, does water actually boil at 100 degrees Celsius? It's like, no, we just take these customs for granted, and then we can build upon them. And that's what science is basically doing, building upon customs. And then he talks a little bit about probability. So he kind of goes over in saying that the way we come to beliefs and the way we form certain judgments is not through demonstrative reasoning or this type of like logical reasoning, more so a probabilistic thing. So remember how there was like these ideas of things that can resemble each other, contiguity, and cause like this golden mountain, where you don't have to have seen gold to imagine this golden mountain. Maybe just something that was like yellowish or goldish, or maybe just a hill, and then like, blow it up and make it like the size of a mountain. And it's from these associative principles that we can form certain judgments and certain beliefs. And so the starting point for him then in section 7, I think, is that we're always observing constant conjunctions, right? So like things following each other, this hitting this, moving that way. One event repeatedly following another. We don't perceive the hidden cause that logically entails that effect. It's not like this moves here and then we see like a little causal alien pushing the phone that way. We just see two things happening in conjunction, and then we fill in the gap. And that gap is the cause, and it's a psychological bias. So it's like almost like the idea of gravity. It's like you don't see it with your naked eye. You just see that it always happens. Probably under a microscope at some time in the future we'll be able to like find the gravitron or explain it in physical terms. And then in that way we'll be able to see gravity. But causation, it's not something that we'll ever be able to see. Or a better example wouldn't have been gravity. A better example would have been light. Like we can see electrons and photons and how they interact and all that. Cause, you can never see cause. You're never going to see the cause atom or the cause molecule. And so, how do we get this idea of these two things being so connected to each other, this causation that we can never see? It's like invisible. And then that's his positive thesis, essentially. So whenever we see two things that follow each other, our bias gets stronger for this cause and effect thing. And this expectation that we have that in the future, the causes, or in the future, two events that happen close together cause each other. this imaginative process is what is filling in the gap and letting us understand, or letting us see causation, letting us think of causation in terms of something that's real. Very, very basically, its necessary connection comes from habit and lively imagination, and that's about it. He kind of repeats himself a lot in the first half of this book, but that's where I end it there. Cool beans. So I'll just go ahead and stop the recording because I don't think that my microphone